Okay, it's noon, everyone, so let's kick off. I want to thank everyone for joining today's webcast on getting going with additive manufacturing. I'm really excited to have our panelists on today. We've got three people who've had deep experience in additive manufacturing. First, Rob Gorham, who is with America Makes, and Rob will introduce himself in a couple of minutes. Luke Boyer, who is with Baker Hughes, and then finally Leroy Sell with PumpWorks, which happens to be the only API 16 and ANSI pump manufacturer in the United States. So our agenda today is going to cover a few topic areas. Rob's going to give us an overview of additive manufacturing, and then Luke and Leroy will give us their personal experiences with additive manufacturing, some real-life case studies on what they've gone through to apply additive manufacturing in their business. And then we'll wrap up with some Q&A, and then I'll have an announcement on the next event that's coming up. Just in terms of some logistics for the webcast, if you look at your screen, on the lower right-hand side, you'll see a little Q&A box. So feel free to type in any questions that you might have. We'll cover them certainly at the end, but if we might end up jumping in on a couple of your questions during the webcast. So with those introductions in mind, let me turn it over to Rob Gorham with America Makes, who's going to give us an overview of additive manufacturing, not just in terms of technology, but in terms of how you might approach the use of this technology philosophically in your business. Rob.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. As Mush said, my name's Rob. I'm the Executive Director of America Makes, and we're an interesting organization in that we're not a manufacturer. What we are is a public-private partnership with over 220 companies, academic institutions, and other government organizations that are part of our consortium with really one intention in mind, and that's to accelerate the adoption of additive manufacturing across the United States landscape. And so we've been working really hard over the last 6 years to make sure that people understood not just the definition of 3D printing, but how to take advantage of 3D printing for the ultimate benefit of the business. 3D printing has been defined by ISO ASTM 52900-15 as having 7 processes, but more simpler than that. If you're not familiar with additive manufacturing or 3D printing, before I get into describing what it is, you'll hear additive manufacturing, you'll hear the word 3D printing. Those are really synonyms. There's a lot of different ways to describe the process of adding and bonding layers of material to form a part. And that's what we're going to talk about over the next hour. And the reality is it's a fairly simple process to understand in that it starts with the design file, and then that turns into a raw material input, really being able to generate a nearly finished part in a matter of hours. And so the difference between additive manufacturing and more traditional manufacturing is that you're adding material versus subtracting material. And there's a lot of ways to do that. As I mentioned, ISO ASTM 52900-15 describes this as having sort of 7 families of additive manufacturing. The first is called vat polymerization. There's another one called powder bed fusion, then binder jetting, material jetting, sheet lamination, material extrusion, directed energy deposition. And all of those have different materials. They have different processes in terms of whether it's powder or whether it's wire, whether it's plastic wire or metal wire, whether you're using different types of heat, whether it be light or energy, I should say, or lasers or electron beams. And so it's very complicated, but that's okay, because I think over the next hour, perhaps we'll help try to bring some clarity around the different options that do exist for each of you that are interested in how additive manufacturing might benefit you. Something that I think is interesting to consider is this. When we talk to a lot of our members across the 220 organizations, usually they tell me they're interested in using the process for 5 or 6 sort of major reasons. The first is they're looking to reduce material inputs. They're looking to lean out their manufacturing process, and they think that additive manufacturing can be a way to do that. They're also looking in some cases to simplify production processes, reducing costs of the production process itself. And then in some cases, they're looking at improving process flexibility. They're looking for ways to react faster to demand. They're looking for ways to use printing to make more customized or lower volumes in some cases that are more specific to someone, a client perhaps, who has a very specific need. And then in some cases, they're looking to reduce the capital cost of entry into new markets. That can be accomplished by prototyping the solution with which you intend to sell, or using the process of printing itself to enter into that new market, because you can actually manufacture in a lot of lower volumes. And the last thing I'll say, sort of on why people are interested in additive manufacturing, is they're really looking, in some cases, in a way to redesign supply chain networks into more of a decentralized, distributed framework. Sort of this idea of gone are today of these big giant factories, and perhaps we can de-risk due to market volatilities, big giant production capabilities with some of these more decentralized production capability around the country. And then, Moshe, if you don't mind, I'll share one more thing that I think is important for people to consider. When you start to imagine sort of your current business, and as you start to think about sort of where you are, there's a great report by Deloitte, and Deloitte published this report, and it's around the supply chain evolution, and they characterize where you sit today in sort of 4 areas. They've got 4 paths. The first path they call stasis, and what they mean by that is that you're really looking for the printing process to support things like design and rapid prototyping, maybe some custom tooling, maybe some low-rate production. And the point that they're trying to make is to get to what they call business model evolution. There's a lot of steps that has to take place. And so I think, to not scare people away, what we don't want people to assume is that you have to go full into the deep end and assume that you're going to go from a complete analog to a digital transformation overnight. It's a journey. And hopefully, Moshe, we can talk about that over the next several minutes.
Sure. Yeah, Rob, can you go into a little more detail on something that you mentioned earlier, which was reducing costs? Based on your experience with the multiple clients and multiple industries that you've worked with, how do your clients view sort of the economic justification of additive manufacturing? I know cost is one of them, but are there other things too that they look at in terms of justifying this journey?
Yeah, so there's the World Economic Forum actually published a report, and they said that in the next 10 years, the global manufacturing economy is going to be a $100 trillion opportunity. And it then goes into breaking out some additional context around that, saying that there's a potential $2 to $3 trillion in the next 5 to 10 years that can be disrupted using printing. And so, and oh, by the way, that translates to about 600 billion to 900 billion inside the U.S. And we could argue up or down 1 or 2 billion here and there, but the point is there's a large opportunity. And so I think there's a lot of different cost drivers that go into it. Like I said earlier, a lot of people are looking for ways to reduce raw material costs. The aerospace industry uses these phrases called buy to fly. How much material do you have to buy relative to the amount of material you're putting on an application? Mm-hmm. And that ratio today is very, very large. And so for them, their interests are specifically in the ability to have to buy less material, spend less time getting to a final part, and that saves production time, material costs, and it becomes a very good economic value proposition to them. But there's also economics around the quote-unquote last mile. And it's how do you get, for example, we've got customers in the Air Force and the Army and the Navy who are looking at how do you get the printing process, the manufacturing capability, to the point where it's very expensive to have to, through high-end and complicated logistics, get spare parts into some places that you just can't drive trucks to, or you can't fly airplanes to. And that's another thing that a lot of people are trying to think about when trying to justify printing. It really is the use case. America Makes is really adamant that you can't just look at printing as, hey, I'm just going to jump in and start printing. You really need to understand there's secondary processes that you have to take advantage of and integrate into the production capability. There's an entire human element piece of it that probably we'll talk about in a little bit around the workforce and education and sort of the design engineers' new perspective that they have to kind of get up to speed on. But then there's the governance and the mission and the insights, governance being policy. I mean, even in today's environment, we see the news talking about certain regulations that are going to impact. It will have impact, whether it's good or bad, there will be impact on the economic justification of printing. And then the last being the use case. And I think it's critically important that you really try to find the economic drivers that would want you to even ask the question, how might I be able to save money, make things faster, have better customer satisfaction? And if printing can be an option to consider, then we can start actually getting into that dialogue. There is just no one-size-fits-all based on what I've seen across all kinds of different industries.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Rob. Can you talk a little bit about going deeper a bit into the types of 3D printing technology, I know that conversation could go on for a long time. But are there sort of broad categories in terms of metal versus non-metal, or even within each category of material, are there certain kinds of 3D printing technology that seem to be used more often in more of an industrial type of an environment?
Yeah, I think I would say that there's really four of them. Material extrusion, you hear a lot of people say the word FDM, fused deposition modeling. That's actually a trademark name by Stratasys, but it's extruding material out of a heated nozzle. There's directed energy deposition. That's a very, very popular process, whether it be laser metal deposition or laser engineered that shape, called lens. A lot of folks are using what they call material jetting, and binder jetting and powder bed fusion. All five of those really are high-end, production-capable processes. They can use metal, they can use plastics. A lot of the literature recently, in my opinion, based on what I'm seeing, is the pivot from sort of rapid prototyping to functional prototyping to tools to low-volume production parts, and that sort of evolution of where we're going has been driving the conversation around metal. Right. Both at the IMTS show in Chicago that I just got back from not too long ago, and the Rapid show earlier in the year. The topic of the year this year has been metal printing. They want to get to the point where they can make extremely capable and functional parts to support some very complicated environments and sort of application intent.
Yeah, it makes sense. It sounds like it's like any other manufacturing technology. There's no one-size-fits-all, which I think you mentioned. No one-size-fits-all technology that's going to apply everywhere, that you really have to have a pretty good understanding and probably some help in deciding where you begin.
Yeah, Moshe, one last thing I'll tell you is I get a lot of people say, hey, Rob, I want to buy one printer. What should I buy? And you can't answer that question without first trying to understand why are you asking the question. And once you start to peel back that layer and can get to the sort of the root of the reason they're asking it, we can make an informed decision. And that would be my encouragement for anybody that's watching. It would be my encouragement for people who are going to attend with us at Houston in a few weeks, is to really begin to think, what are your drivers? Why do you need to get better? And if you don't need to get better, then maybe you don't need to get involved in the conversation. But the reality is, every report that you can possibly imagine is saying there is going to be a disruption as part of Industry 4.0. 3D printing is here to stay. It's going to be part of the conversation. My encouragement would be to start thinking about how to take advantage of it now.
Yeah, makes sense. So, Rob, before we move on to the other panelists, can you share a bit more about America Makes and how you work in the industry and maybe some success stories that you've seen?
Yeah, sure. As a mission-driven nonprofit, again, I'm not in the business of trying to compete with the private sector. And what's really great about that and the position that I sit in is I get to walk into businesses on the private side, walk into businesses on the public side, find ways to de-risk, in some cases competitors working together, but really trying to bring an entire sort of supply chain approach to any problem we solve. So we want to see a large systems integrator, we want to see a machine manufacturer, we want to see a material provider, we want to see some tier 1, 2, and 3 supply chain partners to solve some of these what we call foundational issues, pre-competitive problems that if not solved, the industry in general will suffer. And we, over the last 6 years, have invested over $100 million across 70 projects to do a lot of great work. And the neat thing about America Makes, and this is not meant to come across as a plug, but that our membership gets to share in all of that research and all of the results. And it's up to our members, though, to determine how they ultimately want to take advantage of it. I will tell you, though, there's plenty of success stories on our website. There's plenty of examples of commercialized products that resulted in opportunities to make money for businesses. We've seen mergers and acquisitions happen because of some of the research that we've done over the last 5 or 6 years. And I'd like to say one more thing. I think it's critically important to realize that part of what I think we all need to understand is the importance of road mapping, and not road mapping for the sake of just going through the exercise of documenting a future state we don't intend to sort of travel along, but the road mapping around sort of the economic value, job creation, education skills, sustainability, the advancement of the technology, also looking at things like sort of national defense and security. And then the last thing I might say is domestic security. All of those pieces, regardless of what industry you are in, you have certain roles. And we've got some literature that can help with that. We look across global, community, state, city. We talk about impacts, and then we start building out sort of these sub-tiered roadmaps that people can take advantage of and look at if you're interested.
And so I'd encourage everybody to go to America Makes website to learn more about how you can interface with that organization. And as a participant on this webcast, we'll also be sending out a summary roadmap early next week to give everybody an idea of how they can think about moving forward using additive manufacturing. So Rob, thanks a lot. We'll certainly come back to you with some other conversations.
Okay, great, thanks.
So let me turn it over to Leroy Sell. So Leroy is with PumpWorks, as I mentioned, and he is responsible for a variety of additive manufacturing initiatives within his company and broadly with manufacturing in general. And so I thought we could hear from Leroy on some real-world examples of how he's implemented additive within the business.
Hey guys, my video showing up now?
It is, yeah.
Okay, perfect. So Leroy Sell, I'm the Vice President for PumpWorks 610. As Mush stated, we make centrifugal pumps. We're the only ones making API and ANSI pumps 100% in the United States, primarily catering to oil and gas. And really, what allows us to compete in the United States is our speed. And to maintain that speed, what we're using is both leveraging technologies and sheer brute force. And on the technology piece, the 3D printing plays an integral role, both in allowing us to deliver some of our standard products to the marketplace, and also particularly, which really allows us to capture market share in certain areas, is developing and bringing new products to the marketplace faster than anyone else. So what we're utilizing from a technology standpoint, in our foundries, we have 3D printers that print in foundry stand. I believe it'll be the jet deposition that Rob was talking about. It's injecting a binder. And what this allows us to do is we can completely eliminate making the wooden pattern from the process. The sand casting process really hasn't changed from when our founding fathers were doing that in the beginning of our country. And now we can eliminate that whole step, print the mold, and that cuts weeks, if not months, off of that process.
Leroy, what do you have to change in terms of your engineering processes or quality processes, et cetera, to switch from the old way of making molds to how you're making molds now?
From an engineering standpoint, I think the technology piece, designing in real 3D CFD and using 3D solid modeling, it lent itself very well to switching to this. I think the benefits there, it meshed really well, and really it was the biggest hurdle from a technology standpoint or engineering standpoint was actually trying it out and seeing where some of the shrink or chip that you're going to be adding to those models. It was an iterative process there to fine tune that.
And how long, when you first started working on this change, did this testing process, the experimentation process, take you weeks or months? How long did it really take you to really gain confidence that using additive manufacturing in this application really made sense for you?
The whole process was probably several years, where we were able to contract these services initially, doing a one or two off here or there, and that allowed us to build the experience and confidence to where we purchased one and now two of these printers for our foundry itself.
So you have two of these printers that you actually own that are within your operations, is that right?
Correct. Well, we lease them from them, but they're ours to use exclusively in our foundries there.
I see. And what kind of training processes did you have to go through to get your people ready to use this new technology?
So we have an interesting agreement with them to where X1 will supply operators, but then the real challenge was how we design and lay out our molds now. All your rigging and risers and everything else has to be done ahead of time, and we're using technology as well with some of the solidification modeling to be able to design those layouts for it.
So, Leroy, you probably could have used additive, or still can use additive manufacturing in different parts of your business. How did you come up with the choice to start here versus maybe other areas within your business?
This one was particularly attractive because usually the critical path for a centrifugal pump is going to be the castings. And because of this, being able to eliminate the pattern, it really, from an economic standpoint, when we could deliver faster than anyone else, you can name your price. And then it also eliminates the upfront capital costs for that pattern, particularly on low volume items where your return on investment, those economics get really tough if you're only going to make a few parts.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Well, this reminds me of something you said earlier about thinking about the various drivers, economic drivers. In this case, in Leroy's case, speed was absolutely an important part of how they have leveraged additive manufacturing. So, Leroy, when you look at where you are now, what are the next steps for you?
Right now, we're really trying to push the boundaries and limits of what we can do for true production. It's we're constantly taking iterative steps with both how we recycle some of the resources, particularly the sand, and then also how we design and lay out our boxes when we're printing them. And looking to the future, I was at IMTS as well a couple weeks ago, and some of the real exciting stuff was that metal printing. I think ultimately that could actually displace or obsolete these 3D sand printers we have, where we don't even have to make a casting for some of them, and you can just print the metal shape, the complex metal shape that you want.
Right. Well, that's really interesting, Leroy. Well, thanks a lot for that information. We'll probably come back to you with some additional insights. So let me turn it over to Luke Boyer with Baker. Luke, can you tell us about the additive manufacturing journey at Baker Hughes, and where you guys have decided to begin, and what you've learned along that journey?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And thanks, Mush and Rob, and it's a pleasure to be presenting next to you, Leroy. So Baker Hughes is a full-stream oil and gas company, meaning from downstream to midstream to upstream, and where additive manufacturing has taken off across that entire value stream has very much depended on what their issues are. Baker Hughes was somewhat, I would say, almost naively 5 years ago, jumped into additive manufacturing almost as an inventory replacement. And for those who are thinking of that path, I strongly recommend that you don't do that. There was a bit of a back step then in terms of, okay, where do we use this technology? Not in immediate production and manufacturing wasn't it right off the bat. So then we connected with technology and engineering groups. And at that point, we were a solution looking for a problem. And that's always a difficult place to be. Since then, we have been working with training programs, both internally developed, externally developed, to raise not only additive manufacturing awareness, but also design for additive manufacturing principles across the company. And we've been highly successful, I would say, especially in the past 2 years. So just like with Leroy and his experience, it took us a couple of years to really get started.
So as you look back on the initial stages of your journey, Luke, what can you share about the things that didn't work, lessons learned, etc.? Yeah,
it's a great question, right? It's always easier to talk about the things that you did right versus the things that you did wrong. So as I mentioned, definitely in terms of lessons learned, it was moving in directly into manufacturing. Rob made a great point. I wouldn't have it in your mind right now that you're immediately going to jump there. I think that if we had been able to structure processes in place, I would say implement additive manufacturing in processes where they are looking for a solution. So, for example, in early stages of technologies, when there was a failure, at any one of these, if we had some additive manufacturing champion or someone who knew about additive manufacturing to be part of that discussion to say, hey, maybe additive manufacturing could play a role here, I think that definitely would have helped with the uptick, because at that point, the additive manufacturing group would have immediately been showing value.
And explain the journey on how to sell the idea of additive manufacturing within your company, because with any new technology, and I would imagine with a sort of a traditional oil and gas related company, there tends to be a resistance to change at times, and maybe for the risks involved in changing the way that we're making something. What was that journey like for you, Luke, to sort of sell throughout your company and up into your organization?
Mm-hmm. So you're definitely alluding to the point that it was difficult, and you were spot on. What we had tried to do was, kind of take a top-down approach, and oftentimes that doesn't really work. Instead, then there was an organizational shift, if you will, to have more of a pull, so to incentivize various product groups to take on additive manufacturing, as opposed to having it, pushed upon them. And then at the same time, I think what has been really successful was to create what I would call kind of a champions network, people who you're able to really demonstrate value of additive manufacturing, educating, letting these people see hands-on what additive manufacturing can bring, some of the nuances of the process. That means, physically hosting them for a week or two on site with where you have a machine, and let them see what is the operations, what does it actually look like when you print, what do printed parts look like, and then you send those champions back out into the thicket, and it makes your job a lot easier. I think it's a tried and true method for adoption of a lot of different technologies, not just additive manufacturing.
It really sounds like that Baker had to invest a lot of money into educating first a small group of people, the champions, just so there'd be some increased level of comfort with using this technology or experimenting with it.
So certainly to begin with, there was a lot of investment of time, and time and money somewhat equate to each other, but in terms of capital, to get people, again, kind of up to that awareness factor, that was certainly more time spent than money spent. But yes, quite a bit of money has also been spent in these endeavors.
So we've got a couple of questions that I'll pitch out just to each of the panelists, and maybe one or both of you or three of you can take it. One of the questions is, with the technology evolving so quickly, how do you decide when to buy a piece of equipment, and how long it needs to depreciate before you decide to upgrade it? So maybe we can talk through the sort of the decision-making process of buying equipment. So maybe Luke, you can kick us off with that, then I'll pitch it to our other two panelists.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a bit of a shift, I would say, in mindset here in terms of when to purchase a piece of equipment. It's tough to say exactly, I think, because there's such a dichotomy of people who have owned a piece of 3D printing equipment and those who have not, and the battle and the struggle of learning how to operate that piece of equipment really sets the two apart. Now is the time, I would say, to be honest with you, to talk about depreciation. I'll be honest with you, this is Baker Hughes has a humongous finance department, and that's all kind of there to, let them take care of that. And in terms of upgrading, you don't need to buy a piece of equipment, you can lease it. and leased it for 2 years. It's something that Baker definitely has in their mind, that things are shifting and moving so quickly. For those who are at Rapid or IMTS, as has been mentioned earlier, it's just incredible the rate of movement. So, yeah, I almost say lease instead of buy at this point, unless you have a business case. But even then, I'll be honest with you, most companies I know that have a business case around purchasing a piece of equipment, that business case gets thrown out the window pretty quick. Not to say the machine doesn't get used, it's just the business case doesn't really hold much water.
So
Mush, may I say something real quick? Because I think Luke just hit something that's very, very key. A couple of panels I've sat in lately, a lot of people say exactly what he said. You're going to go buy it with an intention to use it, but you're likely going to use it in ways you never expected. And I think to sort of affirm what he just said, standing and waiting for the perfect opportunity is the wrong thing to do. Whether you need to spend $500 on a desktop printer just to start experimenting with the idea of designing in 3 dimensions, or you want to dive in and get a $500,000 or more machine, I would encourage you to do it as soon as you can and as soon as it's feasible for your business.
Thanks, Robert. Leroy, what about you? You mentioned that you are leasing your equipment. How did you come to that decision versus buying something, and then how might you think about it going forward?
So I know for us, we were real fortunate to where we could experiment in the beginning just through contracting it. X1 has services where they'll go through, and we could do one-offs with them. And then the 2 concerns is with buying a piece of equipment is, one, what if the gamble doesn't work out, and 2, how quickly is it going to become obsolete as well. So I think right now, from our standpoint, we're not looking at any business cases to try to purchase this equipment, and we'll let the economics kind of work itself out on that standpoint in the future. If there's from upgrading, that'll be a lot easier when you're leasing, and then also if the technologies make it completely viable for production, maybe at that point we would look to purchase.
Thanks, Leroy. I'll share our experience at APS Plastics. So we have decided to partner up with an organization called TXRX, which is a makerspace here in Houston, and they have a variety of additive manufacturing technologies. And for the reasons that both Luke and Leroy and also Rob have talked about, which is that we're not really sure what to buy, but we want to have access to a number of different kinds of technologies because we're in an experimental phase. And so, frankly, we don't have the confidence to even select the right kind of machine. And so partnering up with, in our case, a makerspace, or Leroy, in your case, with a supplier, seems like a really sort of a way to lower the risk of beginning the additive manufacturing journey. So another question is around testing. So with traditional manufacturing technologies, we've got sort of these tried and true testing methodologies or QA/QC methodologies. But with additive manufacturing, it seems like we might have to rethink the way that we test finished components. So I'd like to pitch that question out to the 3 of you to see if you have any thoughts on how you test things that are 3D printed versus using traditional manufacturing technologies. Luke, maybe we can begin with you.
Yeah, happy to start off on this conversation. It's a very different mindset, right, in terms of material testing and material properties. What I sort of envision it or use the analogy is that in the past, with conventional materials, whether that be bar stock, pipe, whatever, you have these mills that have been operating for decades, if not, close to a century, and there's a lot of history there. Instead, now you are the mill. The machine is the mill. You create you have your raw material and you create your powder, let's say, and then you create the material. So how do you set up some sort of test protocol, that you can believe in? And we have taken all sorts of various approaches. I will say that they've all been pretty conservative, especially being oil and gas. But there are techniques. I don't necessarily want to go into exactly what Baker's doing, But there are techniques in terms of, destructive testing. There are what everyone likes to refer to as witness specimens or witness coupons. That is, those are specimens, tinsel, Sharpie, cubes where you can look at the density or the microstructure that are printed along with whatever your printed part is, and that are tested along, kind of in parallel. And prior to that, you can do specific studies to see, what is the what's the homogeneous nature, if you will, of your printed plate. So are specimens printed at different locations on the plate? Do they, exhibit, maybe it's a little bit weaker area here, a little bit weaker area there. You can either work at it or you can accept it. And then in those weak areas, that's where you, print those witness specimens.
I see.
So from a high level.
Leroy, how about with PumpWorks? How have you viewed the quality or validation process? Have you had to change the way that you're thinking about versus traditional techniques?
So our experience is a little bit different than Luke's because our 3D printing process isn't the final product of what we're printing. So we're still the casting process itself of the molten metal and composition hasn't changed. But certainly from an inspection standpoint, internally, we're doing test specimens that we'll pour along with that for destructive testing. And then internally, it's more of a feedback loop as well, where if we see, particularly with castings, you're looking at porosity, or if we're not holding our tolerances on some of the cast surfaces, and make iterations on improvements on those. So it's a more of a feedback loop that we had to create than anything else.
Makes sense. Rob, what are your thoughts on looking at testing differently?
So we've been looking at testing differently. The industry is not ready to accept that in most cases. They still want to follow traditional standards and testing protocols, which is fine. And it's a matter of confidence in the process. Excuse me. It's a matter of understanding the variables that can impact the quality of the material, that can impact the quality of the build, that can impact the quality of the part over life, and understanding the failure modes and what that might do long term into these somewhat complicated systems. With that said, there's been a lot of work in this area, trying to use advanced physics and modeling and simulation to be able to model appropriately the process, to be able to start to drive a quality based on models into the certification approach. NIST did a project 3 or 4 years ago where they were building out a testing protocol where they were calling it layer-wise certification, thinking that if you could control the process well enough, that perhaps you could actually qualify, quote unquote, a layer, with the intent that as you continue to build a 3D part, that you could get to the point where you could reduce the amount of physical testing at the end. All of that's awesome. I still think there's a lot of sort of theoretical nuances in that we're going to have to continue to get past. A lot of the work I do with the Department of Defense, they continue to tell me they still want to test it the same way. They want to make a lot of things, break a lot of things, and build statistical representation of what that's going to look like in the field through sort of more traditional means. It's not wrong, and there's, that's a proven method of testing quality. I think, though, what gets exciting to people is the digital nature of the processing, allowing that to evolve into reducing the amount of qualification processes without degrading the qualification itself.
Interesting. It just strikes me as one of those areas for collaboration opportunity between industry partners to try to work out what might be the sort of the new industry accepted standards when it comes to validating 3D printed parts.
Yeah, Moshe, you're exactly right. And there's a lot of work going on at like Lawrence Livermore, Oak Ridge National Lab. The Department of Energy is doing a tremendous amount of work, along with NIST, on some of these high-end physics-based modeling and simulation. And then there's a lot of industry labs that are doing a lot of that too. And you're starting to see some convergence and sort of desires to collaborate. But that kind of stuff is still expensive. I don't know about you. I do not have a supercomputer sitting in my office. One of these days, perhaps I will. But for now, that's still a barrier to some of these desires to reduce traditional testing approaches.
Great. One final question before we wrap up for the three of you. One of the areas that's fascinating to me is how you engage your trading partners when taking the additive manufacturing journey, so suppliers or customers. So let's focus on customers for this one final question for Luke and Leroy. How do you think about engaging customers when taking the additive journey? Because they're obviously in some way, form or another, the end users of this new component. So Luke, can you talk to us about how Baker thinks about how it engages with customers, how much you share with them, and how collaborative you might be with your customers in this journey?
Yeah, absolutely. Very carefully, I would say. The customers, kind of the giants, if you will, of oil and gas, are even more conservative than Baker Hughes. So we are communicating with them very closely in terms of what we share, and then in terms of specifics, we are trying to always be on the lookout of where they are, where they're collaborating in terms of, let's say, like various JIPs or conversations with other third parties for, let's say, corrosion testing, for example. So we will hunt those out and join those because we want to be working together. We don't necessarily want anyone learning off of our back or learning to shave on our beard, as we like to joke. But the conversations are there, and you have to have them. It's not, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's not an easy conversation right off the bat. But you need to get their buy-in, and you need to understand what it is that they're looking for, and be able to push back on them as well, I would say, because honestly, they probably don't know it as well as you do. So it's an educational journey.
Thanks, Luke. Leroy, how about you? How do you engage with your customers in the journey that you're taking?
So our experience is a little bit different than Luke's as well, where we can focus on that the process really hasn't changed. So they don't feel like they're experimenting as much as, say, if you were using an additive metal process. Certainly, the oil and gas major players are going to move extremely slow and be extremely conservative of what they're going to attempt. No one wants to be the guy who tried something new and burn down a facility because of that. And so what we do is we focus on the benefits of the customer, particularly on one-offs that they are lowering their entry level into that part. We don't have to recover that capital cost of the pattern right away, and the speed. There's a lot of people who we're fortunate as well. We go up to them, we tell them that we can do. In some cases, it's the impossible for anyone else, and I mean they're willing to accept it just because we're able to get them that part that they need. So we've been really fortunate in that standpoint.
Great, Leroy. Thank you. Rob, what are your thoughts on engaging with trading partners with the additive journey?
Yeah, it's been interesting because we've been having to do this and serving sort of as an unbiased, neutral platform to allow these conversations to take place has been a benefit of my existence, the organization's existence for the last 6 years. I can't tell you the amount of times where we've had organizations, extremely competitive organizations, asked to use the fact that they're part of this desire to grow the ecosystem and help that justify why they need to have a conversation. And it's opened up doors, and there's plenty of documented use cases around this using sort of us as a platform. And it's opening up doors to accelerate the desire to use printing down through the supply chain partners in a way that's having big impact. But it's also very difficult. I mean, it feels a lot like when you first meet someone, you're kind of very standoffish, but it evolves and you start to build trust in relationships. So I kind of like both Leroy and Luke's comments where you can't be afraid to start the discussion, but you have to at least start the discussion. And it's going to be clunky and awkward at first, And as you continue to build sort of common expectations on what this can do for us, then it starts to make real progress. You know, I think, you know, when you think about what it means to engage, in my opinion, the global race is on. I mean, it's real, it's here. And I think that the first leaders who are willing to step up to the plate, understand how to build this 3D printing ecosystem, are going to be the winners. Relevancy will still be maintained by those that engage, but the concern I have is that if you follow too far behind, you're going to get left in the dust, right? And I kind of have been saying a lot of this over the last, you know, hour or so. So, you know, I'm a big believer of trying to be a first mover, but careful and cautious without being, you know, irresponsible, to continue to sort of build out what can ultimately be a positive implication for, you know, wherever you sit. And that is part of our responsibility as leaders, is to know those conversations are hard, have them, and make progress.
Great, thank you, Rob. I think those are very insightful words. Well, let me wrap up with one final question for the three of you, then I'll close the webcast for today. So, in my experience, when I've listened to webcasts or gone to conferences and things like that, I've always struggled to figure out what to do next, what to do when I show back up to the office tomorrow morning. And so, my challenge question to the three of you is, for someone who's just beginning the additive manufacturing journey, or may even actually be somewhere down the road, what's one thing that they can do tomorrow morning, one positive action that can get them going down the road or get them moving faster down the road? So I know that's a tough question. So let me kick off with you, Rob, and how would you respond to that, just in maybe in around 15 to 20 seconds or less?
Yeah, I'm going to give you three things. You've got to go buy Terry Woller's report, and it'll give you a snapshot immediately into the global landscape. You got to go to www.deloitte.com/insights. They've done a tremendous amount of work. And the third would be, there's a new recently published report called 3D Printing, Ensuring Manufacturing Leadership in the 21st Century. It was by HP, done by A.T. Kearney. Those three things I think are great resources. And the last thing I would say is, go buy a printer, a cheap one, and just start using it.
Great, thank you, Rob. Leroy, how about you? What's the one thing that someone can do to get going?
I think the biggest thing, at least from our experience, was, you know, find that niche where you can start to exploit it, and even if you can start small and experiment with that, and you know, it limits your exposure, but yet you can get out there and learn a tremendous amount from that. There's a lot of things where if you aren't trying it, you're not going to really be able to learn nearly as much as you would if you are.
Great. Thank you, Leroy. Good advice. And Luke, finally with you, where should someone begin?
Yeah, so I'll a little bit jump on Rob's coattails there about learning and then networking and then learning more. I think that along with those three sources that Rob had mentioned, you know, LinkedIn is a phenomenal resource in terms of what people what they'll put out, what they'll share. There's a lot of learning that's available out there. From there's newsletters, websites, etc. And it's just really impressive to grow the network out. And then, you know, have that champions network, or that one champion. Create that one, maybe it's you, you know, and then implement yourself in the processes where people have a problem and they're looking for a solution. That's it.
Great. Thank you, Luke. Well, I'll share our experience on that. We have a sub $1,000 3D printer in our office, and we're just trying to make things. Most of them don't really work. Most of them don't really fit the purpose that we're going for, but we're learning the language of additive manufacturing just by printing things. And we've conducted about a dozen experiments in the last 90 days with 3D printing, and 2 or 3 of them have actually made a difference in our operation. And there's no way we would have been able to get to that without actually printing something. So I think the 3 of you provided really valuable guidance. So let me wrap up with a couple of announcements. So we've got some information that we'll share. Rob, we'll share some of the information that you suggested to the extent that it's available online. We'll put that into several links that we'll send back out to the audience. The recording for this webcast will also be available in a few days' time, so we'll certainly send that out for people to share. And then I want to announce an event that I'm really, really excited about. On November 6th in Houston, we will be conducting a live event. This live event is something we're calling a community of practice. Our goal is to bring together 8 to 10 companies who are trying to go down the road of using additive manufacturing in their businesses. And we're going to invite them to come with 1 or 2 use cases that they've been thinking about. And during this live event, we'll team them up with additive manufacturing experts who will help them create this roadmap and help them actually accelerate their journey into additive manufacturing. So look out for that announcement. We'll be sending that out over the next several days, and more information as time goes by. But circle November 6th for that live event. As I said, I'm really excited about it. I think it's going to be an interesting time for each of us to learn as a community. So once again, thank you everybody for joining the webcast today. Luke, thank you for your time. Leroy, for your time also, and Rob for yours. So enjoy the rest of your day. I appreciate everyone's time and attention today, and look out for more information from APS Plastics and American Aches on taking the additive manufacturing journey. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you much.
Thank you.